Picture standing on a rugged coastline or hiking through a deep valley. Have you ever stopped to wonder how these landscapes came to be? What immense, almost unimaginable force could carve through solid rock, shape entire continents, and leave behind such breathtaking beauty? The answer lies not in fire or wind, but in ice. Rivers of ice, miles thick and older than human civilization, that once flowed where we now walk, work, and live. These glaciers were not just frozen water, they were architects of our world, silent and patient sculptors that shaped the very ground beneath our feet and the connections between distant lands. It's almost unbelievable to think that something as seemingly static as ice could possess such raw, transformative power. But during the Ice Age, colossal sheets of ice covered vast stretches of the planet, grinding down mountains, gouging out deep valleys, and creating pathways that would later allow plants, animals, and even humans to journey across continents. These lost rivers of ice did more than just reshape the land. They forged corridors of life and movement, influencing where civilizations would rise, how ecosystems would evolve, and ultimately, the course of history itself. From the vast plains exposed by lowered sea levels to the fjords that became havens for exploration and trade, glaciers left a legacy that is both profound and visible all around us, if we know where to look. In this video, we're going to travel back in time to an era of ice and mystery, to uncover how these frozen giants carved routes between continents and set the stage for the world we know today. We'll explore how glaciers connected Siberia to Alaska, how they sculpted Europe's most dramatic landscapes, and how their meltwater filled basins that became highways for human migration. This is a story written in stone and ice, a tale of incredible natural forces and their enduring impact on geography, ecology, and human destiny. So settle in and open your mind to the wonders of Earth's glacial past. You're about to see the familiar world through entirely new eyes. To truly grasp the scale of this transformation, we need to step back in time, not just a few thousand years, but millions. The Earth of 2.6 million years ago was a planet on the cusp of a profound change. The relatively stable and warm climates of the preceding epochs were giving way to something entirely new and turbulent. This marked the beginning of the Pleistocene, a chapter in our planet's history defined by a relentless climatic pendulum swing. The world began to oscillate between long, intensely cold periods where ice dominated the landscape and shorter, warmer interglacial periods like the one we live in today. This wasn't a single, sudden big freeze. It was a cycle, a rhythmic pulsing of ice advancing and retreating across the continents. The driving forces behind this great chill are a complex dance of planetary mechanics, subtle shifts in Earth's orbit and tilt, known as Milankovitch cycles, which altered the distribution of sunlight and triggered a cascade of feedback loops involving atmospheric carbon dioxide and ocean currents. As the planet cooled, precipitation increasingly fell as snow, and in the high latitudes and lofty mountains, that snow began to accumulate. Year after year, century after century, the snow piled ever higher. The weight of countless winters compressed the lower layers into dense, granular firn, and eventually into solid, crystalline ice. This was the birth of the continental ice sheets, immense domes of ice that would grow to be thousands of meters thick. Imagine ice so massive that its weight would later depress the very bedrock of continents beneath it. These weren't just patches of snow, they were dynamic, living entities. From North America, the Laurentide ice sheet sprawled outward, eventually covering much of Canada and reaching deep into the northern United States. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet enveloped Scandinavia and northern Europe. Other significant sheets covered parts of Siberia, Alaska, and of course, Antarctica and Greenland were entombed. With so much of the planet's water locked up in these frozen reservoirs, global sea levels plummeted by over 100 meters, exposing vast stretches of continental shelf that are now submerged. This created new lands, new coastlines, and crucially, new bridges between continents. The stage was now set. The actors, these titanic rivers of ice, were in position. The landscape was a blank slate of rock and soil waiting, and then gravity took over. The immense pressure within these ice sheets made them behave like a slow-motion fluid. They began to flow outward from their centers, creeping inexorably across the terrain. This was the dawn of the Ice Age, a period of unparalleled geological drama where the silent, grinding force of ice would begin to sculpt the world, carving out the very pathways that would shape the future of life on Earth. But to call them simply rivers of ice is to only scratch the surface of their complex nature. These frozen giants are more akin to a slow, geological heartbeat, a pulsing, living system that breathes and moves in timescales almost incomprehensible to us. Their journey begins not with ice but with snow. In high mountain basins and polar plateaus where winter's chill persists, snowfall accumulates year after year. Each new layer adds weight, compressing the layers below. The delicate, intricate snowflakes are gradually transformed, first into a granular, sugary substance called firn, and over decades or even centuries, that firn is compressed further into solid, air-bubbled glacial ice. This metamorphosis is the glacier's birth, a patient creation story written in frozen water. Once a critical mass of about 50 meters thick is achieved, the immense pressure triggers a remarkable physical change deep within the ice. The ice crystals under this colossal weight actually begin to deform and slide past one another. This internal deformation, combined with the ice sliding over the bedrock below on a thin film of meltwater, is what allows the entire massive structure to flow. It's a movement so gradual you could watch it for a lifetime and perceive no change, yet over centuries its power is absolute and undeniable. They don't just sit there, they creep, they ooze, they inch forward with a persistent gravitational pull, following the path of least resistance down valleys and across plains. And as they travel, they become nature's most powerful earth movers. The base of a glacier is a chaotic, gritty world of rock and debris. As the ice grinds over the landscape, it acts like a colossal piece of sandpaper, scouring and polishing the bedrock beneath in a process geologists call abrasion. But that's only half the story. Meltwater seeps into cracks in the bedrock during the day and freezes solid again at night. When the glacier moves, it literally plucks or quarries entire boulders straight out of the ground, incorporating them into its icy base to use as even more effective tools for carving. This combination of abrasive sanding and powerful plucking is what allows these rivers of ice to sculpt such dramatic and enduring signatures on the land, from the deep U-shaped valleys that slice through mountain ranges to the sheer cliffs of cirques and the breathtaking depths of fjords. Grasping this dynamic nature is absolutely essential, because it's this very movement and erosive power that prepared the stage for the next incredible act, the carving of continental pathways that would forever change the story of life on Earth. Now, to truly appreciate the monumental scale of this glacial sculpture, we need to peer beneath the ice and understand the mechanics at work. Picture the base of a massive glacier. It's not a smooth, clean sheet of ice sliding over a polished floor. Instead, it's a chaotic, grinding workshop, a geological factory where the landscape is being fundamentally reshaped. This transformation happens through two powerful and complementary processes: the relentless 1-2 punch of glacial erosion, abrasion and plucking. Abrasion is the glacier's sanding tool. As the ice flows, it drags along a massive load of rock and debris it has gathered from the landscape, everything from fine silt to massive boulders. These fragments are frozen into the ice at its base, creating a giant, natural sheet of sandpaper. With immense pressure from the weight of the ice above, this abrasive layer is ground against the underlying bedrock. This action scours, polishes, and scrapes the surface, leaving behind telltale parallel scratches and grooves known as striations. Geologists can read these striations like a map, tracing the precise direction a glacier flowed thousands of years ago. This process can smooth entire mountain slopes into sweeping, rounded forms known as roches mountainais, which from a distance look like a flock of stone sheep resting on the hillside. But abrasion alone isn't responsible for the most dramatic carvings. That requires plucking or quarrying. This is the glacier's chisel. Meltwater from the surface and pressure melting at the base seeps into every crack and fissure in the bedrock. When the temperature drops or pressure changes, this water refreezes, expanding with incredible force and widening the cracks. As the glacier continues its inexorable forward motion, the ice literally freezes onto these loosened rocks and yanks them right out of their place, incorporating them into its icy underbelly to be used as even more tools for abrasion. Plucking is what creates the jagged, fractured, and steepened rock faces often found on the downflow side of a rocky obstacle, leaving a landscape that looks quarried by giants. Combination of these two forces is what creates the most iconic glacial landforms. While a river cuts a narrow, V-shaped valley, a glacier, with its broad, overwhelming bulk, gouges out a wide, deep, and steep-sided U-shaped valley. At the glacier's origin high in the mountains, plucking and abrasion work in concert to carve out dramatic, bowl-shaped hollows called cirques, often cradling pristine alpine lakes long after the ice has retreated. And when a glacier carves a U-shaped valley so deep that it reaches below sea level and the ocean later floods it, the result is a breathtaking fjord. Those deep, steep-walled inlets that define coastlines from Norway to New Zealand. The efficiency of this entire erosional engine isn't constant. It depends on a fascinating interplay of factors. The thickness of the ice is crucial. A thicker, heavier glacier generates more pressure and moves faster, dramatically increasing its grinding power. The slope of the bedrock matters too. Steeper slopes can accelerate ice flow, intensifying erosion. Even the type of rock plays a role. Softer, more fractured rocks like shale and limestone are easily scoured and plucked, while harder, more resistant granite might be polished smooth but erodes far more slowly. It is this variable, relentless application of force over millennia that allowed ice to not just scratch the surface, but to carve pathways deep enough to connect continents and shape the course of human history. Now let's zoom in on one of the most dramatic examples of ice's indirect influence, the Bering Land Bridge. This wasn't a landform carved by glaciers, but a pathway created by their sheer, staggering presence. At the peak of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was frozen into the massive continental ice sheets that global sea levels plummeted by over 100 meters. This dramatic drop exposed a vast, low-lying plain connecting what is now Siberia and Alaska, a region geologists call Beringia. For thousands of years, this was not a bridge at all, but a continent in its own right. A sprawling subcontinent nearly 1,600 kilometers wide from north to south. It was a world born entirely from the cold, a direct and undeniable consequence of the Ice Age's grip on the planet. While glaciers didn't sculpt this bridge directly, their influence defined every aspect of it. To the east, the colossal Cordilleran ice sheet buried the mountains of western Canada, while to the west, ice gripped the highlands of eastern Siberia. These immense frozen masses drastically altered the local climate. They acted like a giant, cold barrier, blocking much of the moisture from the Pacific Ocean from reaching the interior of Beringia. This created a unique and surprisingly hospitable environment known as a mammoth steppe, a cold, dry grassland unlike the barren tundra one might expect. This was not a frozen wasteland, but a fertile, grassy plain teeming with life. It supported an incredible array of now extinct megafauna: woolly mammoths, steppe bison, giant ground sloths, and scimitar cats all roamed this expansive territory. This rich ecosystem provided the resources that would make human travel not just possible, but sustainable. The story of human migration across this bridge is a tale of timing and opportunity. As the ice sheets reached their maximum extent, they not only lowered the seas to expose the land, but they also forged the final crucial element, the access routes. The very edges of the ice sheets themselves became the guides. Along the boundary between the towering Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets in North America, a narrow, ice-free corridor eventually opened. Think of it as a geological alleyway between two walls of ice. Simultaneously, as sea levels fell, a vast coastal route was revealed along the Pacific shoreline, offering another potential path south. These were the gates that the Ice Age unlocked. For generations, the first peoples of the Americas likely thrived within the Beringia refugium itself, isolated from both continents by the encircling ice. Then, as the climate began to warm and the glaciers started their slow, grinding retreat, those gates began to creak open. Small bands of hunter-gatherers, following the herds they depended on or exploring new territories, began to move eastward out of Beringia. They traversed the newly opened corridors, stepping from the world of the mammoth steppe into the virgin landscapes of the North American interior. This migration was one of the most pivotal events in human history, the peopling of an entire hemisphere. And it was made possible not because glaciers carved a path with their ice, but because their existence on a global scale rewrote the very map of the world, creating a temporary continent that served as a crossroads for life. While the Bering Land Bridge provided the doorway, the journey south into the heart of the Americas was guided by the hand of another, even more colossal ice giant. The Laurentide ice sheet was a behemoth of almost unimaginable scale, a dominating presence that covered nearly all of Canada and reached as far south as the modern-day cities of New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. At its peak, this single ice sheet contained more than 22 million cubic kilometers of ice. To put that into perspective, if all that ice were to melt today, it would raise global sea levels by over 60 meters. Its weight was so immense that it literally pressed down on the continent, depressing the ancient bedrock beneath it by hundreds of meters, a colossal burden that the Earth is still, to this day, slowly recovering from. As this titan advanced and retreated over thousands of years, it didn't just cover the land, it actively and violently reshaped it. One of its most famous and enduring creations is the chain of the Great Lakes. These vast inland seas are not simply depressions filled with water. They are the deeply scoured footprints of the glacier's most powerful ice streams. Imagine tongues of ice several kilometers thick, flowing with immense pressure over a landscape of relatively soft sedimentary rock. The glacier didn't just dig holes, it systematically excavated, using its embedded tools of rock and debris to gouge out and deepen pre-existing river valleys. The basins for Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, and Ontario were all carved down to depths far below sea level, their floors a testament to the raw, grinding power of the ice. When the climate finally warmed and the ice retreated, meltwater and precipitation filled these colossal scrapes, creating the largest system of freshwater lakes on Earth. a lasting resource and a major transportation corridor that would define the region's ecology and human history. The Laurentide sculpting was both grand and intricate. In what is now upstate New York, the ice sheet didn't carve one massive basin, but a series of deep, parallel troughs. As the glacier flowed southward over the Appalachian Plateau, its weight and movement gouged out long, narrow valleys. When the ice melted, these perfectly U-shaped troughs filled with water, creating the 11 slender, deep bodies of water known as the Finger Lakes. Their striking, linear formation is a textbook example of the glacier's directional flow, a frozen signature permanently etched into the landscape. Further north and east, the story becomes even more dramatic. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the ice sheet carved through coastal mountains with ferocious intensity, creating deep, steep-sided valleys that reached far below the ocean's surface. As the ice retreated and sea levels rose, the Atlantic Ocean rushed in, flooding these glacial troughs and creating the breathtaking, cliff-walled fjords that now define the coastline, a landscape that rivals the majesty of Norway. But the ice was more than just a destructive force. It was also a chaotic and prolific builder. As it advanced, it acted like a colossal conveyor belt, picking up and transporting unimaginable amounts of rock, gravel, sand, and clay, everything from powdered rock flour to house-sized boulders. When the ice eventually melted, it dropped this entire load, creating a new layer of topography across the continent. This glacial debris, known as drift, formed a diverse array of landforms. Long, snake-like ridges of sediment called eskers trace the paths of ancient subglacial rivers. Smooth, teardrop-shaped hills called drumlins point in the direction of the ice's flow, like enormous stone compass needles left behind. Vast, flat plains of sorted sand and gravel, known as outwash plains, were deposited by glacial meltwater rivers, creating the incredibly fertile soils that would later become the breadbaskets of the American Midwest and the Canadian prairies. Perhaps one of the most profound changes was the glacier's ability to rewrite entire river systems. The pre-glacial Mississippi River was a very different waterway, with its headwaters likely located much farther north. The advancing ice sheet acted as a massive, impermeable dam, blocking these ancient drainage routes and forcing the rivers to find new paths. The Mississippi was diverted and reconfigured into the course we recognize today, while other rivers, like the Ohio and the Missouri, were also significantly altered by the ice's presence and the deposition of its debris. These newly formed river valleys, along with the ice-free corridors that opened between the melting lobes of the ice sheet, became the very highways that guided the first human explorers southward. They followed these freshly carved pathways, hunting the herds of caribou and other game that flourished in the new, post-glacial landscapes, unknowingly walking a continent that had been, quite literally, prepared for them by the immense and patient power of ice. While North America was being reshaped by the Laurentide ice sheet, across the Atlantic, another frozen giant was performing its own act of continental sculpture. The Fennoscandian ice sheet, centered over what is now Sweden and Finland, enveloped much of northern Europe, its influence reaching deep into the continent's heart and leaving a legacy that is still dynamically unfolding today. The most visually stunning testament to its power are the Fjords of Norway. Imagine the immense pressure of ice, thousands of meters thick, flowing relentlessly westward from the Scandinavian mountains towards the sea. This ice didn't just follow existing river valleys. It exploited weaknesses in the bedrock, gouging and deepening them with phenomenal force. The result was the creation of deep, U-shaped troughs that sliced through the coastline, their floors carved far below current sea level. When the ice finally melted and retreated, the Atlantic Ocean rushed in, flooding these sheer-walled canyons and creating the breathtaking, deep blue fjords that define Norway's western coast. These aren't just beautiful landscapes, they are direct vertical slices into the sheer power of glacial erosion. Similar, though smaller, fjords were carved along the coast of Scotland and Iceland, each one a monument to the ice's passage. The work of the ice, however, was not confined to the spectacular coasts. Inland, the Alps were being transformed into the iconic mountain range we know today. Vast alpine glaciers, flowing like frozen rivers from high-altitude accumulation zones, carved the characteristic sharp peaks and horned summits like the Matterhorn, and scooped out deep, amphitheater-like hollows called cirques at their heads. As these glaciers flowed downward, they merged into larger valley glaciers, their combined abrasive power systematically widening and straightening pre-existing V-shaped river valleys into the broad, U-shaped troughs that now provide such ideal routes through the formidable mountain barrier. Valleys like the Rhone in Switzerland and the Salzach in Austria were fundamentally reshaped by this process. Long after the ice was gone, these smooth, flat-floored valleys became the natural highways for human movement. They guided Roman roads, medieval trade routes like the Brenner Pass, and eventually modern highways and railways, connecting the cultures and economies of northern and southern Europe for centuries. The very paths that facilitate travel today were, in essence, paved by ice. But the ice's impact was far more than skin deep. Its weight literally changed the shape of the continent. The Fennoscandian ice sheet was so unimaginably heavy that it pressed the entire Scandinavian landmass down into the underlying mantle, much like pressing a thumb into a soft foam ball. In some areas, the crust was depressed by over 800 meters. When the ice melted, that immense weight was lifted, and the land began to slowly rebound, rising back up in a process known as glacial isostasy. This isn't just ancient history, it's happening right now. Scandinavia is still rising at a rate of nearly 1 centimeter per year in the northern Gulf of Bothnia. This ongoing uplift is constantly altering coastlines, creating new land from the sea and affecting harbors. Ports that were once deep enough for large vessels may find themselves slowly becoming shallower, while new skerries and islands emerge from the waves, a visible, real-time demonstration of the Ice Age's enduring influence. The retreat of the ice sheets also unleashed torrents of meltwater that carved their own signatures into the European landscape. As the ice melted, colossal volumes of water were released, forming massive, temporary rivers far larger than any existing today. These powerful flows carved out great spillways and channels, further refining the drainage patterns the glaciers had established. The water also sorted and distributed the unimaginable amounts of debris the ice had left behind. This outwash, consisting of well-sorted sand and gravel, was deposited in vast, flat plains beyond the ice margin. These glacial outwash plains, known as sandur, proved to be exceptionally well-drained and fertile. It is no coincidence that many of Northern Europe's major cities, including Berlin and Warsaw, are built upon these glacial deposits. The ice, in its retreat, provided the very foundation for agriculture and settlement. The final touch on this remodeled landscape was applied by the debris dumped directly by the ice. As the glaciers melted, they dropped their load of unsorted material, creating a rugged, hummocky terrain of ridges called moraines. These moraines often acted as natural dams, blocking valleys and creating lakes. Lake Garda and Lake Como in the Italian Alps are stunning examples, their basins carved by ice and their ends dammed by glacial debris. In flatter regions, the rolling hills left by the ice's retreat provided strategic high ground for fortifications and settlements, while the depressions between them filled with water to become lakes or wetlands. This new topography, a direct result of glacial deposition, dictated where people could live, farm, and build. From the deep fjords that provided sheltered harbors for Viking longships to the fertile plains that fed growing populations, the icy hand of the Pleistocene glaciers didn't just shape Europe's rocks. It fundamentally guided the course of human history, carving the stages upon which our story would unfold. While Europe's story was written in fjords and moraines, Asia's glacial history unfolds on an even more epic scale, a tale of ice meeting the world's highest peaks and its most expansive plains. The most dramatic stage for this story is undoubtedly the Himalayas, the planet's greatest mountain range. Here, the collision of tectonic plates provided the raw material, but it was the relentless work of glaciers that sculpted it into a navigable world. High in the thin, cold air, alpine glaciers have been carving away at these soaring peaks for millions of years. Their most crucial contribution wasn't in the towering summits, but in the spaces between them. As these rivers of ice flowed downward from their accumulation zones, they gouged deep, U-shaped valleys and, crucially, eroded the mountain cols, the low points between peaks, into accessible passes. These weren't gentle slopes, they were high-altitude gateways forged by ice and waiting for humanity to discover them. Passes like the Karakoram Pass and the Kardungla became the vital arteries of ancient trade, the very foundation of what we now know as the Silk Road. This legendary network of routes connecting China to the Mediterranean relied entirely on these glacial gifts. Caravans of camels and traders carrying silk, spices, and ideas didn't cross over the impossible peaks. They moved through the gaps that glaciers had patiently prepared for them, facilitating a cross-continental exchange that shaped civilizations for centuries. Beyond carving these critical pathways, the glaciers of the Himalayas performed another, even more profound act. They built and shaped the Tibetan Plateau, often called the roof of the world. This vast, high-altitude desert is not a flat plain but a complex landscape molded by ice. During past glacial periods, much more extensive ice caps and valley glaciers covered the plateau, scouring its surface, smoothing its ridges, and excavating its basins. The immense weight of this ice even contributed to the plateau's overall elevation through complex isostatic interactions. But the legacy of this icy past is most visible in the water. The plateau holds the largest volume of ice outside the poles, in the form of thousands of glaciers that act as a massive, frozen water tower for Asia. The meltwater from these glaciers doesn't just form streams. It feeds the headwaters of the continent's greatest rivers, including the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Yangtze. The fertile plains of India, Pakistan, and China, which support billions of people, are ultimately watered by this ancient glacial reserve, a slow-release gift from the ice ages that continues to sustain life today. Venture north from the high mountains, and the story of ice in Asia shifts from dramatic carving to a more subtle, yet equally powerful, influence of cold. Siberia presents a different kind of frozen world, one dominated not by flowing glaciers but by the pervasive grip of permafrost and the immense weight of continental ice sheets that advanced and retreated over the landscape. Here, the ice's role was less about carving sharp relief and more about shaping the very drainage of the land. The massive ice sheets that periodically covered parts of western Siberia acted like a colossal, impermeable blanket, blocking and diverting the natural flow of rivers. As these sheets melted, they released unimaginable volumes of water, which pooled in the depressed, poorly draining landscape they left behind. This process was instrumental in forming the sprawling Ob River system, one of the longest in the world, and the mighty Yenisei River. These weren't just rivers, they became the superhighways of Siberian exploration and conquest. For centuries, these wide, slow-moving waterways were the only practical routes through the trackless taiga and tundra. Cossack explorers, fur trappers, and later Soviet geologists used these rivers to penetrate deep into the continent's interior, following pathways whose very scale and course were dictated by the meltwater of vanished ice sheets. The presence of all this ice, from the Himalayan glaciers to the Siberian ice sheets, did more than just change the shape of the land. It rewrote Asia's climate script. The towering, ice-clad Himalayas act as a monumental barrier to atmospheric circulation, forcefully blocking the moist monsoon winds from the south and creating the intense rain shadow that defines the dry Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert. But the relationship is a two-way street. The vast, white, reflective surfaces of the glaciers and snowfields themselves cool the air above them, strengthening the temperature difference between the land and the ocean that drives the monsoon system in the first place. Scientists now understand that changes in the extent of Himalayan ice over millennia have directly influenced the strength and reach of the Asian monsoon, determining which regions received life-giving rain and which suffered drought. This intricate dance between ice and atmosphere meant that the glaciers were not passive sculptures. They were active players in shaping the climatic pathways that dictated where forests could grow, where grasslands could thrive, and ultimately, where human agriculture could take root and flourish across the continent. Yet while the ice sheets of the north were actively carving the world we know, another continent, shrouded in isolation and cold, holds secrets of an even more ancient glacial past. Antarctica is not merely a blank expanse of white. It is a frozen archive, a continent-sized vault preserving a history of ice that stretches back tens of millions of years. Today, it is encased in an ice sheet so immense it contains 90% of the world's freshwater, averaging over 2 kilometers thick. This colossal dome of ice is so heavy that it has pressed the entire landmass down, in some places pushing the bedrock far below sea level. But beneath this seemingly monotonous, frozen shell lies a landscape of breathtaking drama and mystery, a world completely hidden from view, sculpted by ice when the continent was in a very different place, both geographically and climatically. This hidden world was revealed not by shovels or ice picks, but by the sophisticated technology of radar and seismic imaging. Scientists flying precise grid patterns over the ice sheet send radio waves pulsing downward. These waves travel through the ice, which is largely transparent to them, bounce off the hidden bedrock below, and return to the aircraft. By meticulously timing their return, researchers can map the contours of the land beneath 2 miles of solid ice. What they discovered was astounding. Instead of a flat, featureless plain, they found a terrain rivaling the Alps in its grandeur. Deep valleys slice through the subsurface, and towering mountain ranges pierce the darkness, all completely buried. The most spectacular of these is the Gambatsev mountain range, a massive chain similar in size and scale to the European Alps, yet entirely entombed beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. These mountains shouldn't be there according to standard geological models. They are a fascinating enigma, a ghost range from a lost world. The story of how these mountains and valleys were carved begins not in deep freeze, but in a world of green. Antarctica was once the heart of the supercontinent Gondwana, connected to South America, Africa, Australia, and India. It was a warm, forested land, likely inhabited by dinosaurs and later mammals. But as Gondwana broke apart, Antarctica drifted southward, and its climate began to cool. Around 34 million years ago, the first permanent ice sheets began to form on its high elevations, likely in the ancient Gambatsev Mountains themselves. This is where the great sculpting began. Those initial glaciers started to flow downhill, carving the classic signatures of glacial erosion. U-shaped valleys, cirques, and sharp arêtes into the mountains that had nurtured them. They were the architects of their own domain, grinding down the very peaks that gave them birth. This process continued and intensified as the continent fully glaciated, locking these beautifully carved landscapes in a deep freeze, preserving them in pristine condition like a fly in amber, untouched by wind, water, or erosion for millions of years. Studying these hidden features is like reading a history book of Earth's climate. The shape of the subglacial valleys tells glaciologists about the flow and thickness of ancient ice, helping to model how the ice sheet responded to past warming events. The presence of vast subglacial lakes like Lake Vostok and body of freshwater the size of Lake Ontario buried under 4 kilometers of ice reveals that the base of the ice sheet can be dynamic, with liquid water acting as a lubricant that influences how the ice above it flows. This isn't just academic. Understanding how Antarctica's ice behaved in the past is the key to predicting how it will respond to current and future climate change, with profound implications for global sea level rise. But Antarctica's influence extends far beyond its own shores through the immense icebergs that calve from its floating ice shelves. These are not just small chunks of ice. They are colossal tabular icebergs, sometimes larger than small countries, that break away in dramatic events. Once adrift, they become nomadic islands of ice carried by ocean currents. Their journeys can indirectly shape human pathways by posing hazards to shipping lanes in the Southern Ocean, forcing vessels to detour hundreds of miles. More significantly, as they slowly melt, they release cold, fresh water into the ocean, which can alter local sea temperatures and salinity, potentially influencing ocean circulation patterns that regulate climate across the entire planet. In this way, the frozen continent, though isolated, remains an active player in the global system. Its hidden, ice-carved valleys and the bergs they spawn silently helping to shape the connections between continents and climates worldwide. While the glacier itself is a powerful sculptor, its meltwater acts as the precise and often violent finishing tool, carving intricate details into the landscape with a force that can rival the ice itself. This isn't a gentle trickle. It's the unleashing of a continent's worth of pent-up freshwater, and it carves with relentless intensity on 2 distinct fronts, in the open air on the surface and in the hidden, dark world beneath the ice. On the surface, meltwater streams gather into powerful, sediment-laden rivers that flow along the ice margins or across the outwashed plains beyond. These are not clear, blue waterways. They are thick, gray, boiling torrents, heavy with finely ground rock flour that turns them into a potent abrasive slurry. This liquid sandpaper can cut with astonishing speed. A stunning example is the Iron Gates Gorge on the Danube River in Europe. While not carved solely by meltwater, its dramatic narrowing and deepening were significantly accelerated by the colossal meltwater discharges from alpine glaciers at the end of the last ice age. The river, supercharged with glacial outflow and abrasive sediment, sliced through the Carpathian Mountains, creating a deep, narrow passage that has served as a crucial natural corridor between Central and Southeastern Europe for millennia, its cliffs standing as a monument to water's erosive power. But some of meltwater's most fascinating work happens out of sight, in the labyrinthine plumbing systems that form under the pressure and warmth at the base of an ice sheet. Enormous volumes of water flow through tunnels and channels melted into the ice itself, or along the interface between the ice and the bedrock. These subglacial rivers, flowing under immense pressure, act like industrial-grade pressure washers, further eroding the bedrock and carving sinuous pathways. When the ice sheet finally vanishes, the evidence of this hidden hydraulic network is left behind in the form of bizarre and beautiful landforms, long, winding ridges of sand and gravel, often snaking across the landscape for miles, mark the paths of these ancient subglacial streams. These are called eskers, and they are essentially the fossilized casts of those underground rivers. After the ice melted away, the sediment that had been deposited in these tunnels was simply dropped onto the landscape, leaving a raised, serpentine highway of well-sorted gravel. For centuries, humans have recognized the value of these features. Their well-drained gravel tops made them ideal natural roadways. In North America, parts of the Trans-Canada Highway and countless older trails follow the precise routes of eskers, our modern travel corridors unknowingly tracing the paths of water that flowed deep under thousands of feet of ice. Another curious deposit is the Kame, a steep-sided hill of sand and gravel that often forms where a meltwater stream plunged into a crevasse or poured into a depression on the glacier's surface, depositing its sediment load. When the ice melted, this pile of debris was left standing as an isolated hill. Together, eskers and kames form a unique and hummocky landscape known as a kame and kettle topography, a clear sign to geologists that a glacier died a wet and messy death, its final moments recorded in the chaotic assortment of hills and ponds it left behind. These features didn't just create interesting scenery, they provided the raw materials for construction, influenced soil drainage for agriculture, and created topographic variety that supported diverse ecosystems. However, the most dramatic and terrifying expression of glacial meltwater's power is the catastrophic outburst flood. This occurs when a massive glacial lake, dammed by a wall of ice, suddenly breaks free. The most legendary example of this is the repeated flooding from glacial Lake Missoula in North America. This lake was held in place by a finger of the Cordilleran ice sheet acting as a natural dam, containing more water than Lake Ontario and Lake Erie combined. Periodically, this ice dam would become unstable and fail catastrophically. The result was a wall of water hundreds of meters high exploding across the landscape of eastern Washington state with a force greater than 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers in the world. This unimaginable deluge scoured the underlying bedrock clean in hours, carving deep channels known as coulees and leaving behind a vast, barren landscape of eroded basalt known as the channeled scablands. The floodwaters then roared through the Columbia River Gorge, further deepening it, and poured out into the Pacific Ocean, carrying icebergs and house-sized boulders with it. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened dozens of times over 2,000 years. Each flood was a geological instant, a violent spasm that reshaped thousands of square miles of continent in a matter of days. The scablands stand as a permanent testament to the fact that while ice carved the continent slowly and patiently, water, when unleashed by that same ice, could perform acts of geological violence and creation on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. But the story of ice's influence doesn't end at the shoreline. Its power extended far out to sea, rewriting the very map of the world's oceans and creating or destroying maritime highways that would dictate the movement of species and the course of human exploration for millennia. This incredible process was driven by one simple, yet monumental, consequence of the ice ages, the locking away of unimaginable volumes of water. When the continental ice sheets were at their maximum, they held so much of the planet's water that global sea levels plummeted by over 120 meters. To put that into perspective, that's the height of a 30-story building. This dramatic drawdown didn't just make the oceans shallower, it exposed vast expanses of the continental shelves, the gently sloping plains that surround the continents, which are today submerged under relatively shallow water. In Southeast Asia, this sea level drop revealed a lost world known as the Sunda Shelf. What is now a scattered archipelago of islands like Java, Sumatra, and Borneo was transformed into a continuous, sprawling peninsula connected to mainland Asia. This newly exposed land, often called Sundaland, was a continent in its own right, larger than India, covered in lush rainforests and savannas. This wasn't a narrow bridge but a wide, fertile plain that provided a vast, unbroken pathway for plants and animals to move south from the Asian mainland. Tigers, elephants, and rhinoceroses walked to islands that are now surrounded by ocean, while early human populations followed these game trails, eventually reaching as far as the island of Bali. The lowering of the seas by ice didn't just connect a few islands. It fused an entire subcontinent into existence, fundamentally altering the biogeography of the region and setting the stage for human settlement of insular Southeast Asia. On the opposite side of the planet, a similar story unfolded. The same drop in sea level that created the Sunda shelf also fully exposed the Bering Land Bridge, turning the Bering Strait into a wide, grassy plain. But the ice's role in creating oceanic gateways was a two-sided coin. While lower seas built new land bridges, the subsequent melting phase performed an equally dramatic act of world-building through inundation. As the climate warmed and the massive ice sheets began to disintegrate, all that trapped water was returned to the ocean basins. Sea levels rose rapidly, not in a gentle creep, but in pulses and surges as massive glacial lakes burst their icy dams and poured into the Atlantic. This great flooding didn't just erase the land bridges, it actively carved new seascapes. One of the most spectacular results of this flooding was the creation of fjords. These iconic features, like those in Norway, New Zealand, and Chile, are not simply valleys that drowned. They are U-shaped troughs that were carved deep below current sea level by the incredible erosive power of glaciers. When the ice finally retreated and the seas rose, the ocean rushed in, flooding these profound scars in the Earth's crust. The result was the creation of deep, navigable, and sheltered marine inlets. These fjords became instant, perfectly protected harbors and highways. For the Vikings in Scandinavia, these ice-carved fjords were not just home. They were the launch pads for their longships, providing protected access to the open ocean and enabling their expansion across the North Atlantic. The fjords were a direct gift from the glaciers, a network of ready-made maritime routes that facilitated exploration, trade, and conquest. The flooding also created entirely new inland seas. Hudson Bay in Canada is a perfect example. This massive, shallow body of water is essentially the footprint of the Laurentide ice sheet. The weight of the ice had depressed the continental crust beneath it, creating a vast, low-lying basin. When the ice melted and the land was still isostatically depressed, the rising Atlantic Ocean waters spilled over the watershed and flooded this basin, creating the bay. For centuries, Hudson Bay served as the main gateway for European ships into the heart of North America. The Hudson's Bay Company used it as a highway for its fur trade empire, with ships sailing deep into the continent's interior, following a maritime route that only existed because the land had been pressed down by ice and then flooded by its meltwater. This relentless rise and fall of the seas, driven by the glacial cycles, acted as a dynamic pulse for the planet's biogeography. When sea levels were low and land bridges were exposed, continents were connected, allowing for the exchange of species, a process called faunal interchange. When the seas rose, these bridges were severed, isolating populations on islands and continents. This isolation became a powerful engine for evolution, leading to the development of unique species found nowhere else. The marsupials of Australia, the lemurs of Madagascar, and the unique tiger populations on the Indonesian islands are all, in part, a legacy of these ice age gateways opening and closing. The glaciers, through their indirect control of sea level, didn't just carve the rocks, they directed the flow of life itself, connecting and separating worlds in a cycle that has repeated throughout Earth's history, each pulse leaving a permanent mark on the biology of our planet. While the colossal ice sheets were the star performers in this geological drama, their influence extended far beyond their frozen edges into a dynamic and often harsh world known as the Peraglacial Zone. This was the backstage area, the land immediately surrounding the glaciers that, while not buried under miles of ice, was utterly dominated by its chilling presence. Here, the primary sculptor was not the grinding flow of the glacier itself, but the relentless daily battle between freezing and thawing, a process that worked like a meticulous, if violent, preparator for the main ice show. The defining force in this zone is permafrost, ground that remains completely frozen for at least 2 consecutive years, often reaching depths of hundreds of meters. This perpetually frozen substrate acts as an impermeable barrier, setting the stage for a suite of unique and fascinating processes that fracture the landscape in preparation for the glacier's arrival. One of the most widespread and visually striking effects of this freeze-thaw cycle is the creation of patterned ground. This almost artistic phenomenon occurs when the ground repeatedly freezes and thaws, sorting stones of different sizes into intricate designs on the surface. In a process called frost heaving, larger stones, which conduct cold more efficiently than finer soil, cause the ground beneath them to freeze first. This pushes them upward. When the ground thaws, the finer soil fills in beneath the stone, preventing it from sinking back down. Over countless cycles, this slow-motion conveyor belt pushes larger rocks to the surface and moves them laterally, organizing them into stunning circles, polygons, stripes, and nets. From the air, these patterns look like a vast, natural art installation etched into the earth, a direct and beautiful signature of the intense cold that gripped these landscapes. On slopes, the presence of permafrost creates another distinctive process called solifluction. Imagine the active layer of soil, the top portion that thaws in the summer, becoming completely saturated with water because the melted moisture cannot drain through the frozen permafrost below. This layer turns into a heavy, waterlogged slurry. On even gentle inclines, this sodden mass begins to slowly, viscously flow downhill, much like cold treacle pouring off a spoon. This movement isn't a dramatic landslide. It's a slow, oozing creep measured in centimeters per year. As it moves, it piles up at the base of slopes into distinctive, tongue-shaped lobes of soil and rock, known as solifluction lobes. These features give the hillsides a stepped or terraced appearance, as if a giant had taken a trowel and sculpted the earth into overlapping waves. This process effectively smooths and rounds off the topography, gradually filling in minor depressions and creating gentler, more continuous slopes. The most fundamental preparatory work, however, happens at the smallest scale through a process known as frost weathering. Water is a powerful force, and its expansion when it freezes is incredibly destructive. In the Peraglacial Zone, meltwater seeps into every tiny crack and pore in surface rocks. When the temperature drops at night, this water freezes, expanding by nearly 10% in volume. This expansion exerts tremendous pressure, prying the rock apart from within. Over time, this relentless prying action, repeated over thousands of daily cycles, shatters the bedrock. Solid outcrops are broken down into piles of angular rubble known as Felsenmeer, or sea of rocks, and smaller fragments that are then easily picked up and transported by the advancing ice or by meltwater streams. This mechanical shattering is like a geological demolition crew, breaking apart massive, resistant rock formations into manageable pieces long before the main glacial bulldozer even arrives. dramatically increasing the efficiency of the ice's erosive power. The cumulative effect of all these periglacial processes was to fundamentally soften up the landscape for the glaciers by shattering bedrock into rubble, smoothing slopes through solifluction, and breaking down the surface into movable material. The Peraglacial Zone effectively widened and deepened the pathways that the ice would later follow. It pre-weathered the terrain, making it far easier for the flowing ice to scour out those iconic U-shaped valleys and troughs. Nowhere is this legacy more profound than in the vast plains of northern Europe and Siberia. Here, the combined action of frost weathering, solifluction, and the sorting of sediments by freeze-thaw cycles created immense, flat to gently rolling landscapes. These were not the work of the ice sheets themselves, but of the frozen ground that surrounded them. These plains, underlain by thick layers of periglacial debris, were later drained by massive rivers like the Ob, the Yenisei, and the Dnieper. When the ice finally retreated, these river valleys and the wide plains they flowed through became the premier corridors for human migration and settlement. The seemingly featureless expanses of northern Europe and Asia, which would later guide the movement of cultures and armies, were, in large part, a product of this patient, preparatory work at the icy edges, a testament to the fact that the glacier's true power was amplified by the fierce and constant weathering happening just beyond its reach. Yet for all their power to destroy and carve away, glaciers possess a paradoxical creative force, acting as the planet's most prolific and chaotic construction crews. As these frozen rivers finally retreat, they do not leave behind a blank, scarred wasteland. Instead, they deposit an unimaginably vast and diverse collection of debris, meticulously sorted and arranged into entirely new landscapes that would go on to shape ecosystems and human civilizations for millennia. This material, collectively known as glacial drift, is the literal building block of new worlds, dropped haphazardly yet purposefully as the ice gives up its grip on the land. The sheer volume is staggering to contemplate, everything from boulders the size of houses to fine, powdery rock flour, all plucked and gathered from thousands of square miles and then abandoned in a final, generative act. Some of the most visible and enduring of these constructions are moraines. These are not simple piles of rubble. They are the precise historical records of the glacier's maximum extent, its long pauses, and its final melting moments. Think of a glacier as a colossal conveyor belt, endlessly picking up material at its base and sides. When the ice's leading edge stabilizes for a period of time, rather than advancing or retreating, it acts like a stationary dump truck, dropping all of its transported load into a massive ridge at its terminus. This creates a terminal moraine, a sinuous, hilly wall that snakes across the landscape, marking the glacier's farthest reach. A stunning example is the Ronkonkoma moraine, which forms the very backbone of Long Island in New York. This ridge of unsorted sediment deposited by the Laurentide ice sheet did more than just create a scenic hill. It fundamentally shaped the island's geography. It acts as a natural divider between the sandy outwash plains to the south and the more rugged north shore. It influences groundwater flow, and it provided the first settlers with well-drained, defensible high ground for their villages and farms. It is a permanent physical line drawn by ice, a ridge that still dictates where people live and how they navigate the island today. But moraines are just one type of glacial sculpture. The landscape left behind is a gallery of bizarre and beautiful landforms, each telling a different part of the story. Drumlins, for instance, are elegant, teardrop-shaped hills composed of compacted glacial till. Their steep, blunt end faces the direction from which the ice came, while their long, tapered tail points in the direction of the ice's flow. These are not random mounds. They are the result of the glacier actively reshaping its own debris beneath it under immense pressure. Seen from above, a swarm of drumlins looks like a school of stone fish frozen in mid-migration, their aligned forms providing geologists with a perfect compass to map ancient ice flow. Then there are the vast, flat expanses known as outwash plains. These are the products of the tremendous meltwater rivers that flow from the front of a melting glacier. These powerful, silt-laden streams sort the debris with hydraulic precision, carrying away the finer sands and gravels and depositing them in broad, flat layers beyond the ice margin. The result is some of the most fertile and well-drained land on Earth. The entire northern tier of the American Midwest, the breadbasket of the nation, is built upon these glacial outwash plains and old lakebed sediments. The rich soils of Iowa, Illinois, and the Canadian prairies are a direct gift from the pulverizing power of the ice and the sorting power of its meltwater, a legacy of fertility born from barren rock. In Europe, the influence of these glacial deposits is written into both the land and human history. The rolling hills of Pomerania in northern Poland and Germany, and the gentle, sandy plains of Brandenburg surrounding Berlin are not ancient features. They are a young landscape built from the ground up by the retreating Fennoscandian ice sheet. This wasn't just a matter of adding soil. It created an entirely new topography of low hills, thousands of lakes held in glacial depressions called kettles, and sandy, porous plains. This new terrain dictated everything. The well-drained morainic hills became the sites for fortified towns and castles, while the wet, low-lying outwash plains remained as forests or marshes that acted as natural boundaries between emerging kingdoms and duchies. Trade routes naturally followed the dry crests of eskers, those sinuous ridges of sand and gravel deposited by subglacial rivers, which provided firm, well-drained highways through otherwise swampy terrain. The very political and economic map of Northern Europe was, in its infancy, drawn by the retreating ice. By both carving down and building up, glaciers didn't just create a varied landscape. They engineered a world of connectivity, where the very hills and ridges they left behind became the natural routes that facilitated movement, trade, and the exchange of ideas between once isolated regions. This incredible push and pull of ice across the continents didn't just reshape the land. It performed a grand, millennia-long experiment in biology, acting as both a ruthless gatekeeper and a generous benefactor to life on Earth. The advance of a massive ice sheet was an event of terrifying ecological consequence. It wasn't a slow, gentle frost. It was an obliterating, white wall that scoured the land down to bare bedrock, utterly destroying any ecosystem in its path. For the plants and animals living there, the only option was a desperate retreat, a forced migration to stay ahead of the creeping cold. This relentless pressure pushed countless species southward, compressing them into isolated pockets of suitable habitat that stood like biological islands in a frozen sea. These sanctuaries, known as refugia, were the safe houses of the Ice Age, often located in coastal regions or mountainous areas where local conditions remained somewhat temperate. The most famous of these were likely in the southeastern United States and most significantly around the Mediterranean basin. Imagine the Iberian, Italian, and Balkan peninsulas during the height of a glacial maximum. While much of northern Europe was buried under kilometers of ice, these southern regions, surrounded by the moderating influence of the sea, became arks of biodiversity. Ancient oak and pine forests clung to life in these sheltered valleys, providing a home for species that had once roamed across the entire continent. Creatures like the European brown bear, the red deer, and the Iberian lynx were squeezed into these confined spaces, their populations isolated from one another for thousands of years. This isolation within the refugia was not just a waiting game, it was a powerful evolutionary catalyst. Separated populations began to genetically diverge, slowly developing unique adaptations to their specific microhabitats. This period of icy imprisonment set the stage for the incredible genetic diversity we see in European species today, a direct legacy of their long sequestration in these southern sanctuaries. Then the climate would shift, the great thaw would begin. As the ice sheets started their agonizingly slow retreat, they didn't just reveal a barren, rocky wasteland, they unlocked the doors to vast new territories. The melting ice acted like a starting pistol for one of the greatest races in natural history, the recolonization of a continent. Species burst forth from their refugia, following the retreating ice northward. They moved along the river valleys that the ice had carved, across the fertile outwash plains it had deposited, and into the freshly exposed landscapes that were eagerly awaiting their first colonizers. This wasn't an orderly procession but a chaotic, competitive scramble for new territory. You can still read the history of this great migration in the DNA of European forests. Studies of tree genetics show clear patterns tracing back to specific refugia. The oaks of Ireland and England share a closer kinship with those from the Iberian refuge, while the oaks of Scandinavia show a stronger link to those that survived in the Balkans. The ice had not only preserved life but had, in its retreat, painted a new biological map with brushes dipped in those isolated pools of genetic diversity. In North America, the story played out on an even grander scale, with the ice itself creating a legendary pathway, the ice-free corridor. This was a narrow strip of land, perhaps only a few dozen miles wide, that opened between the towering cliffs of the Cordilleran ice sheet to the west and the colossal dome of the Laurentide ice sheet to the east. For millennia, this corridor was closed, sealed shut by the two ice masses meeting, forming an impenetrable barrier that split the continent in two. When it finally opened, it became a vital conduit, a biological hallway connecting the frozen north to the temperate south. This wasn't a lush paradise, it was a harsh, recently deglaciated landscape of rocky rubble, sparse vegetation, and large proglacial lakes, but it was a passage. We know that species like the American bison used this route. Genetic evidence suggests a population of bison moved from Beringia down through this corridor to eventually populate the Great Plains, their descendants becoming the iconic herds that would later define the American West. And they were not alone. This same corridor is central to one of the most heated debates in archaeology and genetics, the peopling of the Americas. For much of the 20th century, the dominant theory held that the first human inhabitants of the continents were the Clovis people, big game hunters who entered around 13,000 years ago by walking south through this ice-free corridor. The idea was compelling. It provided a clear, logical route on the map. However, more recent archaeological discoveries, such as sites in Monte Verde, Chile, and elsewhere in the Americas that predate the opening of the corridor, have seriously challenged this view. This has led to the alternative and now widely supported coastal route theory, which suggests that the first humans migrated south along the Pacific coastline, which was also exposed by lower sea levels, using boats and exploiting rich marine resources. The truth may be a combination of both. The coastal route for the very first pioneers, followed later by a wave of migration through the interior corridor once it became viable. What is undeniable is that the dynamics of the ice sheets dictated all possibilities. They created the barrier, they provided the coastal pathway, and they eventually unlocked the inland corridor, orchestrating the timing and the routes for the movement of humans and animals alike. The distribution of countless species, from the trees in our forests to the large mammals that once roamed the continents, is a living museum, a permanent record of the ice's profound and dual role as both the Great Divider and the great unifier of ecosystems on a planetary scale. These newly revealed landscapes were not just empty spaces, they were vibrant, resource-rich worlds teeming with opportunity for the bands of hunter-gatherers who first encountered them. As the colossal ice sheets retreated, they performed one final act of creation, leaving behind a meticulously prepared stage for human expansion. The grinding ice had pulverized bedrock into fine, mineral-rich soils that would soon support lush grasslands and forests, attracting vast herds of megafauna like mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison. These animals were not just food, they were living roadmaps, their migration patterns and trails instinctively following the most accessible routes through the new terrain, the very valleys, passes, and shorelines that the glaciers had carved. Early humans, possessing an intimate and generational knowledge of their environment, became masterful readers of this glacial handwriting on the land. They understood that following a caribou trail would often lead to a mountain pass, that a river valley with its fresh water and abundant resources offered the safest and most productive path inland, and that a coastline provided a continuous highway rich in both marine and terrestrial food sources. Their survival depended on this acute observation, turning the abstract geological legacies of the Ice Age into practical, life-sustaining routes for exploration and settlement. In North America, the debate over the precise routes of first peopling continues to captivate scientists, but both leading theories are fundamentally stories about following ice-sculpted pathways. The traditional ice-free corridor hypothesis envisions small groups moving south between the decaying Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. This was not a journey through a pleasant valley, but a trek through a stark, recently exposed landscape of glacial rubble, cold lakes, and sparse vegetation, a challenging but passable lane that had been plowed open by the retreating ice. The alternative and increasingly supported coastal route theory paints a different picture, one of skilled maritime people navigating along the Pacific coastline from Beringia down into the Americas. This route was made possible by the dramatically lower sea levels of the glacial period, which exposed a wide, contiguous coastal plain that is now submerged under the waves. These early voyagers would have hopped from one resource-rich estuary to another, their kelp highway offering a staggering abundance of shellfish, fish, marine mammals, and seabirds. Crucially, this coastal margin would have been one of the first areas to become ice-free and habitable, its climate moderated by the ocean. Whether by land or by sea, or more likely a combination of both, the paths were laid out by the retreating glaciers and the changed world they left behind. Across the Atlantic, the story of human movement in Europe is equally written in glacial ink. The great river valleys of Europe, which today host bustling cities and serene countryside, began their modern lives as drainage channels for colossal meltwater rivers flowing from the Fennoscandian ice sheet. The Rhine River Valley, for instance, was massively widened and deepened by the relentless flow of ice that once filled it. As the glacier retreated, it left behind a broad, flat-floored, and perfectly U-shaped valley that cut directly through the heart of the continent's most formidable mountain barrier, the Alps. This was not a subtle path, it was a superhighway clearly marked by nature itself. Similarly, the Danube River Valley was shaped and guided by glacial activity, its course influenced by the deposition of moraines and the diversion of its ancient tributaries by ice. These valleys did not merely guide early hunter-gatherers, they went on to form the backbone of European civilization. They became the routes for Roman roads, the boundaries for medieval kingdoms, and the arteries for trade that connected the Mediterranean world to the North Sea. The Rhine itself became a central axis of the Hanseatic League, and remains one of the world's most critical industrial shipping routes to this day. The legacy of these ice-carved pathways is so deeply embedded in the human geography of Europe that it is almost invisible, yet it is absolutely fundamental to the continent's historical development. This glacial inheritance extends far beyond these famous examples, etched into the very infrastructure of our modern world. If you look at a map of major highways, railways, and even political boundaries, you will often see them curiously aligned with the natural topography. The path of Interstate 90 through the Cascade Mountains in Washington state follows Snoqualmie Pass, a low point in the range carved and smoothed by ancient glaciers. In the United Kingdom, the main railway line from England into Scotland sweeps through the glacial trough of the Tyne Valley. The border between the United States and Canada for much of its length follows the 49th parallel, but in the east, it jaggedly follows the natural, water-filled groove of the Great Lakes, a border defined by a chain of basins excavated by the Laurentide ice sheet. These are not coincidences. When engineers and planners sought the most efficient routes across continents, they consistently rediscovered the same pathways that glaciers had already optimized over millennia of flow: the lowest passes, the gentlest gradients, and the most stable ground. Our modern networks of movement and communication are, in a very real sense, a high-tech overlay on a blueprint that was drawn by ice tens of thousands of years ago, a permanent and guiding hand in the spread and connection of humanity across the globe. While the great continental ice sheets had long since retreated, the power of ice to shape human destiny was far from spent. A much more recent and intimate chapter in this story began in the 14th century and stretched into the 19th, a climatic anomaly that came to be known as the Little Ice Age. This was not a true ice age with massive continental glaciers, but a period of sustained and profound cooling that served as a powerful reminder of humanity's vulnerability to even small shifts in the planet's climate. Average temperatures across the northern hemisphere dipped by between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius, a change that seems almost trivial on a thermometer, but which unleashed a cascade of consequences that rewrote the fortunes of nations, decimated communities, and altered the course of history itself. This era stands as a critical case study, a stark demonstration of how glacial dynamics, even on a smaller scale, continue to hold a sway over our pathways, our economies, and our very survival. The most visible and dramatic impacts were felt in the world's mountain ranges, where living glaciers responded to the colder temperatures with an aggressive advance. In the European Alps, these rivers of ice began to slowly, inexorably, reclaim the valleys they had long ago abandoned. This was not a slow geological process observed over millennia. This was a terrifying reality witnessed within a single human lifetime. Alpine glaciers ground forward, swallowing up alpine pastures, burying forests, and overrunning villages that had been established centuries earlier during the warmer medieval warm period. The Swiss village of Grindelwald, for instance, watched in horror as the lower Grindelwald glacier advanced, its ominous progress threatening to crush the community. In Chamonix, France, the advancing Mer de Glace glacier destroyed farms and homes, leading to desperate prayers and processions in a futile attempt to halt the ice's progress. These advances did more than just destroy property. They severed vital trade routes. High mountain passes that had been reliable conduits for merchants, pilgrims, and armies for centuries became choked with ice and snow for longer periods each year, or were abandoned entirely as the risk of avalanche and impassable conditions grew too great. The network of connectivity that had been carved by ancient ice and utilized by humans for generations was suddenly and violently being rescinded. For societies built along coastlines, the threat came not from advancing ice on land, but from its proliferation at sea. As temperatures dropped, the Arctic pack ice expanded significantly further south, transforming sailing routes into treacherous gauntlets of fog and floating ice. Nowhere was this more devastating than in Iceland. The island nation, heavily dependent on sea trade for essential goods like grain, timber, and iron, found itself increasingly isolated and strangled by the encroaching sea ice. Some years, the harbor at Reykjavik was completely frozen solid, preventing any ships from entering or leaving. In other years, the dense pack ice would surround the island for months on end, blocking all access. The result was catastrophic famine, with imports cut off and local agriculture failing in the colder, shorter summers. The population plummeted. Historians estimate that over a third of Iceland's people may have perished due to famine and disease during the worst years of the Little Ice Age. The Danish crown, which ruled Iceland, often seemed indifferent to the plight of its distant colony, leaving the population to suffer the brutal consequences of this climatic shift. The sea, their lifeline, had become their prison, its gates locked shut by the expanding cold. Perhaps the most iconic historical event tied to this period is the mysterious and tragic end of the Norse settlements in Greenland. Established during the warm centuries around the year 1000 by Eric the Red, these settlements thrived for hundreds of years with a population that may have reached several thousand. They built churches, traded walrus ivory and furs with Europe, and raised livestock. But as the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, their world slowly collapsed. The pack ice increased dramatically in the North Atlantic, making the already dangerous sea voyage from Iceland and Norway even more perilous and less frequent, cutting the settlers off from vital trade and contact. The growing seasons shortened relentlessly, making it impossible to grow enough hay to feed their cattle through the long, increasingly harsh winters. Their subsistence economy, balanced on a knife's edge, crumbled. They faced increasing conflict with the Inuit, who were far better adapted to the changing conditions and the hunting of seals in the expanding ice. The Norse, stubbornly clinging to their European identity and farming traditions, failed to adapt. By the mid-15th century, the Western settlement was silent. By the end of the century, the Eastern settlement had also been abandoned. The last written record from Greenland is a marriage contract from 1408. After that, only silence. The Little Ice Age did not just alter their way of life. It completely erased their presence from the island, a stark testament to the fact that even the most resilient human societies are ultimately at the mercy of the climate. The ripple effects of this centuries-long cold snap extended far beyond the frozen north, influencing some of the most pivotal moments in human history. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed millions across Europe, was triggered by years of torrential rains and unseasonably cold summers that caused widespread crop failure. This period of malnutrition and social upheaval left the population desperately vulnerable to the next great calamity. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it found a populace already weakened by hunger, allowing the plague to burn through Europe with even greater ferocity. In the 17th century, the frigid conditions are now believed to have contributed to the timing and severity of the 30 Years' War, as failing harvests fueled social unrest, desperation, and mass migrations that destabilized entire regions. In art and culture, the Little Ice Age left an indelible mark. The paintings of the Dutch masters, like Pieter Bruegel the Elder, are filled with vibrant, detailed scenes of frozen canals and ice-skating villages, capturing a world where winter's grip was a central part of daily life. This period serves as an undeniable and sobering lesson that climate is never just a background actor in human history. It is an active, powerful force that can topple settlements, reshape trade networks, fuel conflicts, and determine the rise and fall of empires. The Little Ice Age, a mere climatic tremor compared to the earth-shattering ice ages of the past, nonetheless demonstrates with crystal clarity that our relationship with the cold is not a relic of a distant past, but an ongoing and powerful dialogue. But the story of ice's influence extends far deeper than the surface, into the very bedrock of the continents themselves. Imagine the incredible, crushing weight of an ice sheet 2 miles thick. It's a burden so immense that it doesn't just sit on the land. It actively presses the entire continent down into the softer, malleable mantle below. The Earth's crust in these regions behaves less like a rigid slab of rock and more like a stiff foam pad that compresses under a heavy weight. This profound sinking of the land under the unimaginable mass of ice is the first half of a process geologists call glacial isostacy. For thousands of years, the continents literally sagged under this frozen load, with the deepest depressions occurring right at the thickest centers of the ice domes. In places like Hudson Bay, the land was pressed down by over 900 meters. That's nearly 3,000 feet. This created a vast, shallow basin that, when the ice finally melted, would eagerly be flooded by the rising seas, forming the bay we see on maps today. The stage was set for a geological rebound of epic proportions, a slow-motion spring back that is still unfolding before our eyes, when the climate warmed and the ice sheets began their final, catastrophic melt. That colossal weight was lifted. But the land did not snap back into place instantly. The rebound of the crust is an achingly slow, viscous process, a gradual and relentless upward push measured in millimeters per year. This is because the mantle rock deep below the surface is not liquid, but a hot, plastic solid that flows incredibly slowly over centuries. Think of it like pressing your thumb into a block of soft clay and then removing it. The indentation doesn't vanish immediately. It slowly, gradually fills back in. This is precisely what is happening across vast swaths of Canada and Scandinavia right now. The land that was once buried under the heaviest ice is now rising the fastest, like a seesaw tilting back to level. In the northern part of the Gulf of Bothnia, between Sweden and Finland, the land is rebounding at a rate of nearly a centimeter per year. Over a single human lifetime, that adds up to a vertical change of over half a meter, a shift that is anything but subtle for the people who live there. This ongoing uplift is actively rewriting the map, creating new land from the sea at a pace that is literally visible to local communities. In Sweden and Finland, the process has a name: land uplift. For centuries, farmers have watched their coastal properties slowly but surely expand as the shoreline retreats, granting them new, fertile fields that were once part of the Baltic seabed. The Swedish port city of Luleå provides a striking example of the practical challenges this poses. The harbor there, which was once deep enough for large cargo ships, has been becoming progressively shallower as the land rises. The city has been forced to repeatedly move its entire port facility further out to sea to stay in deeper water, a costly but necessary dance with a force of nature. Across the Atlantic, in Canada, the same phenomenon is at work. The ancient beaches of Glacial Lake Agassiz, a massive inland sea that once covered much of Manitoba, are now found high and dry, dozens of meters above the current landscape, silent witnesses to the powerful uplift that has occurred since the ice departed. The effects of this rebound are not limited to the coastlines. They ripple far inland, reshaping the very plumbing of the continents. As the land tilts upward, it alters the gradient of rivers and lakes. A river that once flowed smoothly to the sea might find its course suddenly steeper, causing it to cut down into its bed with renewed energy, or conversely, a different section might become so flat that it begins to meander wildly and deposit sediment, potentially altering its entire course. The vast watersheds of North America, like those draining into Hudson Bay, are experiencing this right now. The slow tilting of the Canadian Shield is gradually stealing water from rivers that once flowed south, diverting their headwaters toward the rising bay. This ongoing adjustment of drainage patterns is a quiet but powerful reminder that the Ice Age is not a closed chapter. It is a story that continues to be written in the rock beneath our feet, its final paragraph still unknown as the land seeks a new equilibrium 10,000 years after the glaciers retreat. Yet the true power of these glacial lakes lay not in their stillness, but in their connections. They were never meant to be isolated bodies of water. They were the central hubs in a continent-wide hydrological network meticulously plumbed by the retreating ice. The meltwater that filled these basins also carved the outlets, the drainage channels that would become the rivers linking them together. This created an integrated system of natural highways. To travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the continent's very core, early explorers and indigenous peoples didn't have to fight through trackless forest or scale impossible terrain. Instead, they could paddle. They navigated a seamless water route up the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario, then portaging around Niagara Falls into Lake Erie, and onward through the straits into Lakes Huron, Michigan, and Superior. This wasn't just a path. It was an engineered corridor, with each lake acting as a massive, calm reservoir that made travel by canoe or bait now not only possible but efficient. The short overland portages between watersheds, often following Esca ridges or glacial spillways, were the only interruptions in an otherwise continuous aquatic journey deep into the heart of the continent. This system became the foundational route for the North American fur trade, with voyageurs and traders moving unprecedented volumes of goods across thousands of miles, following a roadmap that had been drafted by the ice long before humans arrived to read it. This story of glacial hydrology engineering human movement was not unique to North America. Across the Atlantic, a similar network of ice-borne waterways dictated patterns of exploration and trade in northern Europe. The massive Fennoscandian ice sheet, as it retreated, scoured out countless basins and diverted ancient rivers, creating a new aquatic landscape. Two of its most significant creations were Lakes Ladoga and Wonga in northwestern Russia. These are not mere ponds. Ladoga is Europe's largest lake, a vast inland sea itself carved well below sea level by glacial erosion, but their true importance lies in their strategic position. These colossal freshwater bodies became the critical linchpins connecting the Baltic Sea watershed to the Volga River system, which flows south to the Caspian Sea, and to other rivers draining north into the White Sea and the Arctic Ocean. This made them the central transfer points for a continent-spanning trade network. During the time of the Vikings, these lakes were part of the legendary trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a watery highway that allowed merchants to move goods from the Baltic all the way to the Black Sea and Constantinople. Furs, amber, and walrus ivory from the north were exchanged for silver, silks, and spices from the south, with the glacial lakes serving as the indispensable reservoirs that made such long-distance river travel feasible. The legacy of this ice-carved connectivity persists today, with the modern Volga-Baltic waterway still following these ancient glacial channels, allowing ships to traverse the same basic route that Viking longships and medieval traders used over 1,000 years ago. The most breathtaking example of glacial lake engineering, however, is one that has vanished from the map, yet whose legacy is imprinted across an entire region: Glacial Lake Agassiz. This was not a lake in any modern sense. It was a freshwater inland ocean. At its maximum extent, it covered an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, sprawling over parts of what are now Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, and Minnesota. It was born from the meltwater of the retreating Laurentide ice sheet, which acted as a giant dam holding the water in place. For thousands of years, this colossal lake existed, its shorelines shifting as the ice dam retreated, and its outlet rivers carved new channels. The lake itself was a temporary, dynamic feature, but its impact is permanent. When Lake Agassiz finally drained, most catastrophically in a final outburst flood that likely poured into the Hudson Bay and then the North Atlantic, it left behind one of the flattest and most fertile landscapes on Earth, the Red River Valley and the plains of Manitoba. The fine, mineral-rich silt that settled on the lake bottom created agricultural land of almost mythical productivity, but its most profound contribution was the pathway it left behind. The bed of this vanished sea became a natural, perfectly flat corridor, guiding the course of the Red River northward. This low-lying route, a clear track on the map, later became the basis for Canada's Trans-Canada Highway and the main line of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the very threads that bound the nation of Canada together from east to west. The ghost of Lake Agassiz, a lake born of ice, literally provided the roadbed for a country. Now we turn to one of the most volatile and spectacular forces in glacial geology, a dramatic partnership between fire and ice that unfolds deep beneath the surface. Subglacial volcanism is the powerful intersection of Earth's internal heat and its frozen outer shell, a combination that can reshape landscapes in moments of catastrophic release. This process begins not with the slow, grinding patience of ice, but with the restless energy of the planet's mantle. In volcanically active regions like Iceland, Alaska, and parts of Antarctica, magma chambers simmer close to the surface. When this molten rock finds a weakness and forces its way upward, it doesn't always burst into the open air. Instead, it can encounter the immense, crushing weight of an overlying ice sheet, sometimes thousands of meters thick. This meeting of unimaginable heat and incredible cold sets the stage for a geological event unlike any other. The immediate effect of magma rising beneath a glacier is a colossal and rapid transfer of energy. The intense heat doesn't just gently melt the ice, it can flash it into steam, triggering powerful phreatomagmatic explosions that fragment the lava into fine glassy ash. More commonly, the heat steadily melts the base of the glacier, creating vast chambers of liquid water imprisoned between the bedrock and the ice above. These hidden reservoirs are known as subglacial lakes. The pressure from the overlying ice keeps this water in a liquid state, even if its temperature is below the normal freezing point. These are not small pools. Some subglacial lakes, like those in Antarctica, can be the size of large cities, holding volumes of water that rival North America's Great Lakes. They represent a potential energy source of staggering proportions, held in check only by the strength of the icy dam above them. The real drama begins when that dam fails. In Iceland, these events are known by the formidable term jökullaup, an Icelandic word meaning glacier run. A jökullaup is a glacial outburst flood of almost biblical proportions. It can be triggered by a volcanic eruption melting ice too rapidly, or simply by the water pressure in a subglacial lake becoming so great that it literally lifts the glacier off its bed, creating a buoyant dome of ice before finding a weak point and bursting out. The release is not a gentle flow, it is a terrifying, sudden explosion of water, ice, and rock. These floods are among the most powerful natural events on Earth, with flow rates that can exceed the combined discharge of every river on the planet. They don't just carry water, they are a churning, destructive slurry of ice blocks, volcanic ash, and boulders, a chaotic mixture that acts like liquid sandpaper on an industrial scale. The landscape-altering power of a Jökulhlaup is written across Iceland in dramatic detail. The island itself is a hotspot, straddling the mid-Atlantic ridge where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are pulling apart. This makes it the perfect laboratory to witness fire and ice in combat. A prime example is the canyon of the Jökulsá River in northern Iceland. This massive gorge, one of the largest in Europe, was not carved slowly over millennia by a river. Geological evidence points to a series of catastrophic Jökulhlaups originating from a volcanic eruption beneath the Vatnajökull ice cap thousands of years ago. The floods raced northward, and in a matter of days or even hours, the sheer force of the water scoured out the canyon, stripping away bedrock and leaving behind the immense raw scar we see today. Similarly, the vast sand-dune plains along Iceland's south coast, great flat deserts of black volcanic sand, are the direct deposit from countless such floods, where the torrents dropped their immense sediment load as they finally slowed upon reaching the sea. This interplay does more than just destroy, it forges new pathways with startling speed. A single subglacial eruption can melt its way up through the ice, creating a new volcanic peak called a tuya, with a distinctive flat top carved by the ice that once surrounded it. The floodwaters themselves can exploit weaknesses in the bedrock, carving entirely new river channels and canyons that then become permanent features of the landscape long after the flood has passed. They can also obliterate existing valleys, filling them with debris and forcing rivers to find new courses. This constant remodeling, driven by the planet's internal furnace, adds a layer of unpredictable violence to the otherwise slow and steady work of glacial erosion. It reminds us that the carving of continents is not always a patient process. Sometimes it is a sudden, explosive event that can rewrite the map in a geological instant, proving that the Earth's most powerful architects are those that harness the combined, opposing forces of fire and ice. This intricate dance between ice and climate is one of the most powerful examples of a feedback loop in Earth's history, a self-perpetuating cycle where the glaciers themselves became active players in shaping the very conditions that dictated their own existence. At the heart of this process is a simple but profound property, albedo. Albedo is a measure of how much sunlight a surface reflects back into space. Fresh, clean snow and ice have an incredibly high albedo, reflecting up to 90% of the sun's incoming energy. During a glacial maximum, when vast white sheets cover millions of square miles, the planet effectively becomes a giant mirror. This reflection prevents solar energy from being absorbed and converted to heat, which in turn reinforces the cold conditions, allowing the ice sheets to grow even larger and reflect even more sunlight. This is a powerful positive feedback loop, a vicious cycle of cooling that can plunge the planet deeper into an ice age. It's a classic case of the ice creating more ice, a frozen engine that fuels its own expansion. But nature seeks balance, and for every feedback loop that amplifies a change, there is often another that works to dampen it. The very growth of the ice sheet sows the seeds for their own eventual destruction. As the planet cools and more water is locked up on land, global sea levels fall dramatically. This drop can have a counterintuitive effect on ocean circulation, particularly in the critical North Atlantic. The Great Conveyor Belt of ocean currents, known as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, relies on the sinking of cold, salty, dense water near Greenland and Iceland to drive its global flow. This current is responsible for pulling warm, tropical waters northward, moderating the climate of northwestern Europe. However, as the ice sheets grow, the surrounding ocean becomes diluted by a constant trickle of meltwater and by the reduced evaporation in the colder atmosphere. This freshwater is less dense than salt water. It acts like a lid, sitting on the surface and preventing the critical sinking motion that powers the entire circulation system. If this freshwater influx is large and sustained enough, it can slow or even shut down this oceanic conveyor belt. When that happens, the northward flow of warm water stops, and temperatures in the North Atlantic region can plummet dramatically, even as the rest of the globe might be experiencing warming. This creates a complex and often contradictory climatic picture, where local conditions can swing violently against the global trend. Perhaps the most dramatic and well-studied example of this phenomenon is an event known as the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt and intense cooling that struck the northern hemisphere around 12,800 years ago, just as the world was finally emerging from the last ice age. Temperatures in some regions dropped to near glacial conditions in a matter of decades, a geological heartbeat. The leading theory for what caused this sudden big freeze points directly to the melting ice sheets. The vast Laurentide ice sheet still covered much of Canada, and it is believed that an enormous proglacial lake, Lake Agassiz, held back by a melting ice dam, suddenly found a new outlet. A colossal volume of freshwater, possibly more than that of all the Great Lakes combined, was catastrophically released into the North Atlantic via the Hudson Strait and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This massive pulse of freshwater flooded the ocean surface, putting the brakes on the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. The result was a climatic whiplash. The warming trend that had been allowing plants and animals, including humans, to recolonize the northern continents was thrown violently into reverse for over 1,000 years. Glaciers in mountain ranges actually re-advanced, and the newly exposed land bridges and corridors that had been opening up were suddenly reclaimed by cold and ice. For the human populations of the time, this was not an abstract scientific event. It was a catastrophic upheaval of their entire world. The Younger Dryas cooling would have drastically altered resource availability. Herds of game animals upon which hunters relied may have shifted their ranges or collapsed entirely. Plant communities would have struggled in the suddenly colder and drier conditions. For those early pioneer groups who had already moved into the higher latitudes of Europe and North America, this would have been a time of extreme hardship, potentially forcing retreat, fostering innovation in new survival strategies, or leading to local extinctions. The very pathways that had been opened by the retreating ice were now rendered inhospitable and dangerous, a stark reminder that the story of human migration was not a steady, inevitable march forward, but a precarious dance dictated by the erratic heartbeat of the Earth's climate, a rhythm set by the melting and growth of continental ice. This deep interplay reveals that glaciers were far more than just passive sculptures of the landscape or simple indicators of a cold climate. They were dynamic, powerful regulators of the global system. Through their albedo, they controlled the planet's energy budget. Through their meltwater, they had the power to redirect the great oceanic currents that distribute heat around the globe. They created their own weather patterns, with the high, cold domes of the ice sheets generating powerful, frigid winds that swept out across the continents, further reinforcing the cold and dry conditions. In doing so, they didn't just carve physical pathways through rock. They orchestrated the climatic stages upon which the drama of life unfolded. They determined which corridors were open for migration and which were sealed shut by cold, which regions received life-giving rains and which were parched by drought. The story of the ice ages is therefore not just a geological tale of erosion and deposition. It is a profoundly interconnected narrative of how the cryosphere, the world of ice, actively dialogues with the atmosphere and the oceans to write the rules of life on Earth, rules that our ancestors had to learn quickly or face the consequences. Amidst the vast sheets of ice that once blanketed continents, some of the most compelling and mysterious pieces of evidence left behind are not grand landforms, but solitary, out-of-place stones. These are glacial erratics, boulders that were plucked from their native bedrock, transported sometimes hundreds of miles, and then abandoned on a foreign landscape when the ice finally melted. The very word erratic comes from the Latin errare, meaning to wander, and these stones are indeed the great wanderers of the Ice Age, silent nomads that hold within their mineral composition a detailed map of a journey taken thousands of years ago. They are the ultimate geological hitchhikers, and their stories rewrite our understanding of the power and reach of ancient ice. The journey of an erratic begins with the relentless, grinding power of a glacier's base. As the ice flows over a landscape, it doesn't slide smoothly. It freezes onto the underlying bedrock, particularly on the lee side of rocky outcrops. Using the incredible force of its own weight and the expansion of freezing meltwater in cracks, the glacier literally quarries or plucks large blocks of rock straight out of the ground. Once incorporated into the ice, these boulders become tools themselves, helping to abrade and scour the land further downstream. But they are also passengers locked in a frozen embrace, traveling wherever the river of ice dictates. They can be carried near the bottom, scratched and ground down, or they can be lifted high within the ice, traveling relatively unscathed for the entire journey. The distance they travel is staggering. In North America, geologists have traced erratics from their source in northern Canada all the way to the central United States, a journey of over 1,000 miles. In Europe, rocks from Scandinavia are found scattered across the plains of Poland and Germany, and even across the North Sea in the British Isles. For a geologist, an erratic is not just a rock, it's a priceless clue in a continental scale mystery. The first step is identification. By meticulously analyzing the rock's type, mineralogy, and fossil content, scientists can often match it to a very specific outcrop, its point of origin, sometimes called its provenance. Finding a boulder of distinctive red granite sitting atop a layer of entirely different local limestone is the first clue, but the real detective work comes from mapping. By plotting the locations of thousands of these foreign stones and tracing them back to their sources, geologists can draw flow lines that reveal the precise directions the ancient ice sheets moved. It's a form of reverse engineering, using the dropped cargo to map the delivery route. This work was fundamental to proving the theory of continental glaciation in the 19th century. Before this, the presence of these giant, out-of-place boulders was a major puzzle, often explained by mythical floods or even rafting on icebergs during biblical deluges. The systematic mapping of erratics provided the irrefutable evidence that vast, flowing sheets of ice were the only force capable of such a feat. Some erratics have achieved fame due to their sheer size and isolation. The Madison Boulder in New Hampshire is a spectacular example. This massive block of granite is roughly the size of a large house, measuring over 80 feet long, 37 feet high, and weighing an estimated 5,000 tons. It sits alone in a forest, a profound and sudden presence that feels almost otherworldly. It originated from a bedrock source over 20 miles away, and its solitary grandeur makes it a powerful testament to the ice's ability to move mountains, quite literally. Similarly, the Okotoks erratic in Alberta, Canada, is a massive quartzite boulder that was transported by ice from the Mount Edith Cave area near Jasper, hundreds of kilometers to the west. It is the largest known erratic in the world, and its presence on the prairie has made it a significant landmark for centuries. Long before modern geology provided its explanations, these wandering stones captured the human imagination and were woven into the cultural fabric of the landscapes they occupied. Their sudden, inexplicable presence made them natural landmarks, meeting places, and boundary markers. Many were given names and featured in local folklore. In the United Kingdom, numerous erratics are the subjects of ancient legends. The Norber erratics in the Yorkshire Dales were once explained by stories of giants having throwing contests. Other stones were seen as petrified creatures or beings from another world, placed by magical forces. For indigenous cultures, these stones often held practical and spiritual significance. The distinctive lithology of an erratic made it a valuable resource for tool-making. A band of nomadic hunters might track a specific type of stone they knew was good for spear points, following the glacial trail of erratics back to a primary source outcrop. In this way, the pathways carved by ice later became the trade and resource routes for humans, who learned to read the glacial landscape with intimate detail. Some erratics were considered sacred, serving as altars or ceremonial sites, their mysterious journey from a distant land giving them a perceived connection to the spirit world or to ancestral homelands. These stones are more than just geological objects. They are cultural touchstones, connecting us not only across space to distant mountains, but across time to the first people who wondered at their presence and incorporated them into their understanding of the world. Unraveling the epic story of the Ice Ages requires a multidisciplinary toolkit, a scientific symphony where each instrument plays a crucial part in reconstructing a world long since vanished. The investigation begins on the ground with the oldest and most fundamental method, glacial geology. This is the art of reading the landscape itself, of recognizing the distinctive signatures left behind by the ice. Geologists are the detectives at this crime scene, and the landforms are their clues. A smooth, striated surface on a bedrock outcrop tells them the direction a glacier flowed. A sprawling, hummocky ridge of unsorted sediment, a terminal moraine, marks the ice's maximum extent like a frozen tidal line. The long, sinuous snake of an esker reveals the path of a subglacial river, while the elegant, teardrop shape of a drumlin points like a compass needle in the direction of the ice's advance. By meticulously mapping these features across continents, scientists can chart the precise boundaries of ancient ice sheets, understand their flow patterns, and even estimate their thickness, building a three-dimensional model of the frozen world from the physical evidence it abandoned. But to understand the when and the why, we must look beyond the rocks to the very climate that drove these glacial cycles. This is where ice core analysis delivers nothing short of a time machine. In places like Greenland and Antarctica, where ice has accumulated for hundreds of thousands of years without melting, scientists drill deep, extracting cylindrical cores of ice that are like tree rings for the planet. Each layer of ice is a snapshot of the atmosphere from the year it fell as snow. Trapped within these layers are tiny bubbles of ancient air, pristine samples of the Earth's past atmosphere that allow us to measure historical concentrations of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. The ice itself holds a record of past temperatures. By analyzing the ratio of different oxygen isotopes in the water molecules, scientists can reconstruct temperature fluctuations with astonishing precision. These cores reveal a planet pulsing between glacial and interglacial periods, and the data shows an undeniable lockstep relationship between temperature and greenhouse gas levels, providing a critical long-term context for our current changing climate. A single ice core can tell us it was cold, but a network of them can show us how storms swirled and climates shifted across the entire globe. While geologists map the physical stage and climatologists analyze the atmospheric script, geneticists are tracing the movements of the actors themselves, the plants, animals, and humans that navigated this icy world. The field of genomics has opened a revolutionary new window into the past by studying the DNA of living species. As populations of animals were isolated in glacial refugia during ice advances, their DNA accumulated unique mutations. When the ice retreated and these groups expanded and met again, they mixed their genes. By sequencing the genomes of modern species across their ranges, scientists can detect these ancient patterns. For instance, the genetic diversity of North American caribou or European brown bears is not random. It forms a clear map that traces back to their specific Ice Age sanctuaries and the routes they took to recolonize the land. This same technique is powerfully applied to human history. The genetic differences between indigenous populations in the Americas help to clarify the timing and the routes, whether coastal or inland, of the first peopling of the continents, settling debates that archaeology alone could not resolve. The very bloodlines of life carry an indelible record of the pathways carved by ice. The modern era has supercharged this detective work with the power of remote sensing. Technologies like LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, allow us to strip away the forest canopy and see the ghostly imprint of the ice on the bedrock below. Mounted on aircraft, LiDAR scanners fire millions of laser pulses at the ground, measuring their return time to create incredibly detailed, high-resolution topographic maps. In heavily forested regions of North America and Europe, this technology has revealed the subtle contours of glacial landforms that were completely invisible to the naked eye, the faint traces of long-vanished shorelines of glacial lakes, the delicate ridges of abandoned coastlines from when the land was isostatically depressed, and the precise networks of eskers and meltwater channels hidden. Beneath the trees, this bird's eye view allows scientists to map the glacial landscape with a completeness and accuracy that would have taken centuries of ground survey, revealing the full, grand scale of the ice's handiwork. The final picture emerges only when all these disparate lines of evidence are woven together. A sediment core from the bottom of a Scandinavian lake might show a sudden shift in pollen types, indicating the local retreat of ice and the return of forests. That same climatic event will be recorded as a spike in temperature in the Greenland ice cores. The LiDAR map will show the specific moraine that stabilized at that time, and the genomic data from local moose populations will show a genetic bottleneck followed by a rapid expansion northward as the new habitat opened up. It is this interdisciplinary convergence, the marriage of geology, chemistry, genetics, and physics, that transforms individual clues into a coherent narrative. This collaborative effort showcases the relentless human curiosity to understand the forces that shaped our world, proving that the mysteries of the lost rivers of ice are not locked in the past, but are waiting to be decoded through the combined ingenuity of modern science. Yet, even as we uncover these frozen archives, the very ice that preserved them is vanishing before our eyes, thrusting the ancient story of glacial pathways into a startlingly modern and urgent context. The planet is warming at an unprecedented rate, and the great glaciers and ice sheets are now retreating not as part of a natural cycle, but in a rapid, human-driven collapse. This great melt is a double-edged sword for explorers and scientists. On one hand, it is revealing a world that has been locked away for millennia. In the high passes of the Alps, the retreating ice is yielding a trove of artifacts from past civilizations, ancient tools, weapons, and even the impeccably preserved remains of a 5,000-year-old man known as Ötzi. These finds offer an incredible window into the past, but they are emerging only because the ice that guarded them for centuries is now disappearing. Similarly, in the Canadian Arctic and Norway, receding glaciers are exposing landforms and geological features that have been hidden since the last ice age, allowing geologists to study the direct effects of glacial erosion with fresh eyes. These revelations are like pages torn from a history book we are only just beginning to read, but the book itself is being burned to create the opportunity. This unprecedented thaw, however, is simultaneously erasing the very pathways it reveals while creating dangerous new ones. The most immediate and globally significant threat is the rise in sea levels. As land-based ice from glaciers and ice sheets melts and flows into the ocean, it is raising sea levels worldwide, threatening to drown the coastal routes that were so vital to early human migration and modern settlement. The same coastlines that once provided a highway for the first peoples of the Americas are now facing inundation, putting immense pressure on modern cities and infrastructure. At the same time, in the high Arctic, an opposite phenomenon is occurring. The rapid decline in summer sea ice is opening up new maritime pathways that were once impassable. The fabled Northwest Passage, a sought-after shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific that claimed the lives of countless explorers, is now becoming a seasonal reality. While this promises shorter shipping routes and access to new resources, it also brings with it a host of geopolitical tensions, environmental risks from oil spills, and the disruption of fragile Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities. The world is watching a real-time remapping of continental connections, a process that is creating both economic opportunities and profound ethical and security challenges. Perhaps the most pressing concern for a significant portion of the world's population is the impact on freshwater resources. Glaciers are often called the world's water towers, and for good reason. They act as natural reservoirs, storing winter snowfall as ice and then releasing it as steady meltwater during the dry summer months. This reliable water supply sustains rivers that are the lifeblood of entire nations. The great rivers of Asia, the Ganges, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, and the Yangtze are all heavily dependent on seasonal melt from the Himalayan glaciers. For now, increased melting is actually causing greater river flow, but this is a temporary and deceptive bounty. Scientists warn of a looming peak water scenario, after which the diminishing glaciers will no longer be able to supply the same volume of water. The eventual decline will lead to severe water shortages for billions of people who depend on these rivers for drinking water, agriculture, and hydropower. The loss of these glacial reservoirs threatens to destabilize some of the most populous regions on Earth, turning the ancient, ice-carved pathways of these rivers into channels of potential conflict and humanitarian crisis. The understanding we've gained from studying how ice shaped the past is now our most valuable tool for navigating this uncertain future. By comprehending the principles of glacial erosion, deposition, and isostatic rebound, we can create more accurate models to predict regional impact. We can anticipate which areas will experience the most dramatic coastal changes, where new landscapes will emerge from under the ice, and how the Earth's crust will continue to adjust to the vanishing weight. This knowledge is not merely academic, it is critical for practical planning. Civil engineers use these models to design more resilient infrastructure. Urban planners need them to devise strategies for managed retreat from vulnerable coastlines. Conservationists are using this data to identify and protect new habitats that will emerge as the ice retreats, creating ecological bridges for species struggling to adapt to a warming world. The legacy of the ice ages provides us with a deep time perspective, a long view that is essential for making wise decisions in the face of rapid change. The same forces that carved our continents are still at work, and by listening to the lessons they teach us, we can better prepare for the world that is coming. Despite the incredible wealth of knowledge we've uncovered about the ice ages, the story is far from complete. Glacial science remains a field vibrant with passionate debate and tantalizing mysteries, a frontier where every answered question seems to unlock two more. Perhaps the most human of these debates centers on the very peopling of the Americas. For decades, the dominant theory was clear and compelling. The first people walked south through an ice-free corridor that opened between the decaying Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets around 13,000 years ago. This inland highway seemed to perfectly explain the spread of the distinctive Clovis spear points found across North America. But then, the archaeological flaw dropped out. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, which shows clear evidence of human occupation dating back over 14,000 years, completely predate the opening of that inland corridor. This stunning discovery forced a dramatic rethink and gave powerful weight to the alternative coastal route theory. This idea suggests that the first pioneers were skilled maritime people who navigated the Pacific coastline from Beringia, hopping from one resource-rich estuary to another in a world where sea levels were much lower, exposing a wide coastal plain that is now submerged. The debate is far from settled. New genetic studies and tantalizing but often submerged archaeological evidence continue to fuel discussions. The truth may be a complex combination of both, a first wave of coastal explorers followed by later groups using the interior route. This isn't just an academic argument, it's a fundamental quest to understand the ingenuity and resilience of our ancestors and the very pathways that made their incredible journey possible. Beyond the routes of human migration, the basic behavior of the ice sheets themselves is still under intense investigation. We can see where the glaciers were and map what they left behind, but pinning down the precise timing and speed of their retreat is a monumental challenge. Traditional methods like carbon dating of organic material left behind in glacial deposits provide snapshots, but the latest technology is painting a much more dynamic and at times frightening picture. Ice core records from Greenland reveal that the end of the last ice age was not a smooth, gradual warming. Instead, it was a dramatic roller coaster of abrupt climate swings. The Younger Dryas period, for instance, was a sudden return to icy conditions that lasted over 1,000 years, right as the world was warming. What caused this violent hiccup? The prevailing theory points to a colossal influx of freshwater from melting ice sheets disrupting ocean currents, but the exact trigger and the astonishing speed of these changes are still areas of active research. Even more pressing is the question of what initiates an ice age in the first place. The Milankovitch cycle's subtle changes in Earth's orbit and tilt provide the rhythm, the pacing of the glacial cycles, but they alone aren't enough to cause such a dramatic shift. They seem to act as a metronome, setting the beat, but the orchestra of feedback loops involving greenhouse gases, ocean circulation, and ice sheet albedo are what truly amplify that signal into a global deep freeze. Understanding this intricate dance is not just about the past, it is the key to refining our models for future climate change, helping us predict how our own actions might influence the planet's systems on a grand scale. Some of the most heated debates today are happening not in the field, but in front of computer screens, as scientists use advanced modeling to simulate the ancient ice. A major point of contention is the precise extent and thickness of the great ice sheets. Did the Laurentide ice sheet really merge with the Cordilleran to form a continuous, impenetrable barrier? Or were there more numerous and larger ice-free refugia, pockets of land that remained habitable even at the glacial maximum? The answer dramatically changes our understanding of both human and animal migration routes. Similarly, the role of subglacial water is undergoing a revolution in thinking. For a long time, glaciers were modeled as slow, grinding solids. Now, we understand they sit on a complex and dynamic plumbing system. The amount of water lubricating a glacier's base is now seen as a critical control on its speed. A surge of meltwater can cause a glacier to literally lift off its bed and surge forward at an alarming pace. This new perspective helps explain mysterious rapid retreats in the geological record and has terrifying implications for modern ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, where meltwater could potentially accelerate their flow into the ocean and thus sea level rise. The very mechanics of how ice carves the land are being re-evaluated with this lubricating layer of water in mind. The discoveries that fuel these debates continue to roll in, often from the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth. Antarctica, a continent completely encased in ice, is perhaps the greatest source of new surprises. The use of ice-penetrating radar has revealed a hidden world beneath the ice sheet that defies imagination. Scientists have mapped vast mountain ranges, like the Gambatsev Mountains, which rival the Alps in scale yet are completely buried. Even more astonishing was the confirmation of massive subglacial lakes, with Lake Vostok being the largest, a body of water the size of Lake Ontario that has been isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years. The discovery of this entire ecosystem, cut off from the atmosphere, has forced glaciologists and biologists to completely rethink the limits of life and the dynamic nature of the ice sheet above it. The water in these lakes can move, draining and filling in cycles that cause the overlying ice to rise and fall, influencing its flow. Each new discovery from beneath the ice adds a new variable to our models, a new piece of a puzzle that is infinitely more complex and fascinating than we ever imagined. These unanswered questions are not a sign of failure. They are the engine of scientific progress. They remind us that the story of the ice ages is a living narrative, one that we are still actively writing with every core drilled, every satellite image analyzed, and every new theory proposed. The lost rivers of ice have left their mark on our world, and the journey to fully understand their power and their legacy is one of the great adventures of modern science. And so, as our journey through this frozen epoch comes to a close, we're left with a profound sense of awe for these silent, patient architects of our world. The legacy of the lost rivers of ice is not confined to dusty textbooks or distant, ancient history. It is etched into the very ground we walk on, woven into the fabric of our daily lives in ways we seldom stop to appreciate. Every time we travel through a broad mountain pass, navigate a deep water harbor, or even enjoy the produce from a fertile plain, we are benefiting from the work of ice that flowed millennia ago. These glaciers were the ultimate landscape artists, sculpting the stage upon which the entire drama of human civilization would eventually unfold. They carved the fjords that became havens for Viking explorers. They ground down the rock that became the fertile soil of the world's breadbaskets, and they exposed the land bridges that allowed our ancestors to populate continents. Their story is a powerful reminder that the planet is dynamic, constantly changing and reshaping itself over vast stretches of time, with forces at work that are both humbling and magnificent. This deep history is more than just a fascinating tale from the past. It is an essential key to understanding our present and navigating our future. As we now face an era of rapidly melting ice and rising global temperatures, the lessons carved by these ancient glaciers have never been more critical. The same processes that opened pathways for migration are now, in reverse, threatening to flood our coastal cities. The freshwater stored in mountain glaciers, a relic of the last ice age, is a vital resource for billions, and its disappearance will reshape ecosystems and economies. By understanding how ice built our world, we gain a crucial perspective on how its decline might alter it. This knowledge empowers us to make smarter decisions about conservation, infrastructure, and how we adapt to the changes already underway. The past informs the present, and the silent, grinding work of ice offers us a blueprint of planetary change that we would be foolish to ignore. Our exploration of these frozen mysteries doesn't have to end here. The story of Earth's ice ages is still being written, with new discoveries emerging every year from beneath retreating glaciers and from deep within ice cores. Scientists continue to debate the precise routes of human migration, the triggers of glacial cycles, and the secrets hidden in subglacial lakes in Antarctica. This is a living, breathing field of science, full of unanswered questions and exciting possibilities. We encourage you to stay curious, to look at the landscapes around you with new eyes, and to ask yourself about the forces that shaped them. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the frozen chapters of our planet's history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more journeys into the wonders of the past. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments below. What aspect of glacial history fascinates you the most? What other historical mysteries should we explore next? Thank you for joining us on this incredible voyage through